Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile 2 discussion. Today, I wanted to talk about my pick for the most interesting and potentially most powerful ascendancy in PathOfExile 2's early access. This is the Blood Mage, which is an ascendancy found in the Witch class, and it's got a lot of really interesting stuff going on in it. Now, this is going to be one of the weirdest ascendancies in that it has something we've never seen before. There is a mandatory first 2 points. So the start point for the ascendancy is actually here. You are therefore forced to take Sanguimancy with your first 2 points. You have no other options. If you're not interested in taking Sanguimancy, you're going to have to play as something else, and I would recommend in that case considering the Infernalist if your heart is set on the Witch. Now, with Sanguimancy, this is something that has a genuine drawback on it, as well as an interesting upside. The drawback is that skills gain a base life cost equal to their base mana cost. So if a skill has a baseline cost of 16 mana, that baseline cost becomes 16 life and 16 mana, and then this gets multiplied by various things like support gems, as well as increased or reduced by various other effects that might modify costs. So that's the drawback of Sanguimancy. The positive side is that it's going to cause monsters to drop little vials of blood that are basically healing potions, because you're a pretty disturbing character. The life remnants are going to be little vials of blood that enemies are going to drop, and these are things that you can then go and run over. When you pick up one of these life remnants, it's going to give you a healing boost, but this has the overflow mechanic on it. Now, early on when this was first mentioned, overflow was something that the player base, including myself, misunderstood. What overflow means is that this allows you to exceed your usual maximum life. So if your maximum life is 4,000 and you are at 3,700 health and you pick up a life remnant that's going to restore 700 health, this will actually let you get to 4,400. The precise mechanics of overflow are not yet completely known, but I believe that you're allowed to go up to double your normal maximum life. This will be something that will have to be adjusted or once we've played with this in practice and just made sure that that is the precise definition of overflow, because there's a number of other ways it could be implemented that aren't exactly the same. How do you get these life remnants, you might be asking? Either kill a weak enemy or critically hit a stronger one. Now, the critical hit ones, these are something that are going to be with a cooldown as well. So it's not like you can just spam crit after crit after crit on an enemy. You're going to have to wait a little while in between them. There's a cooldown applied. The exact time of that cooldown is something we'll learn a little bit later. So that's the starting point. Sanguimancy on its own is probably better than having nothing, but it's definitely not a strong first node, and it's also a node that's not always positive. Because Sanguimancy has all of these side effects associated with it, the rest of the Ascendancy is absolutely stacked with power. So let's go through and have a look at what we've got here, starting with the 2 4-point options. Now remember, you've already spent 2 points just getting to Sanguimancy, so essentially these are 6 points away from the origin, which means you cannot take both of them. Also, taking one of these is a huge investment, so it needs to have a lot of power in it. Let's start with the critical hit side. We have Gore Spike first. Now this is based upon your life, and it believed that it would be based upon your current life at the time you cast a skill, although we will definitely test this once we actually get to play around with it. 1% increased critical damage bonus per 40 life. What this means is if you've got 4,000 maximum life on your character and you are at 4,000 life, then this is going to be 100% critical strike multiplier. This is an enormous amount in PathOfExile 2 from what we've seen so far. Now I'm going to suggest here that this is something that you want to take by default, but it is not your second point. The reason for that is that critical damage bonus is actually a weaker stat earlier in progression, because you probably don't have that high a critical strike chance yet, and on top of that, your life total is not going to be all that high, and this scales with your life total. So this is definitely something that you'll take later in progression. Remember, you cannot change out of an entire ascendancy, but it does seem that you will be able to respec points that you've spent within an ascendancy. So if you spec points into this tree and then you decide later, oh, you know what, I really wish I'd gone Infernalist instead, sorry, you're out of luck. But if you decide that you are quite happy with the Blood Mage, but you wish you'd spent your points differently, I believe you'll be able to do that. It'd be nice to get some absolute clarification on that, but we'll have that reasonably soon. In any case, Gore Spike will become better the further you go in progression. You'll get more critical hits, so it'll proc more often, and you'll have more life, so it'll be a bigger percentage. However, this leads to Sunder the Flesh, which has tremendous synergy with Gore Spike, because Sunder the Flesh causes the base critical hit chance of your spells to be 15%. Now this is going to be something that will have divergent merit depending upon the skill you're using. I think this is going to be one of those things not that many people will take, but for the people who do take it, it's going to be the best notable on their entire Ascendancy. So keep this one in mind as an option. Ultimately, my thoughts are that you probably don't take 5 and 6, the Gore Spike and Sunder the Flesh side, until you're fairly well established at endgame, and then you potentially spec into them at that point, having previously gone with something else instead. Additionally, one thing that needs to be said at this point, and this is something that will apply to every other Ascendancy in the game as well, we don't know how far into progression it will be that you will get your 4th Ascendancy points. In PathOfExile 1, this comes online about the time you're doing your 40th map. Usually you're already strong enough by the time that you get yourself an offering to the goddess, at least for veteran PathOfExile 1 players, and you can probably take it on reasonably soon after getting into maps if you wanted to rush it. However, in PathOfExile 2, it's entirely possible that the Ascendancy trials just are quite a bit harder. There hasn't been many years of power creep. When the 4th Labyrinth was added to PathOfExile 1, it was actually quite hard. It was probably in line with maybe where the Maven is in difficulty now, somewhere between the Shaper and the Maven probably, in terms of the amount of difficulty that was required just to beat the 4th Labyrinth. There's been a lot of power creep since then, and so it's faded away, and it's a lot easier than it used to be. But it was commonly the case that people would be asking for carries through the 4th Ascendancy during the 2nd week of a league. So keep that in mind. It may be that you want to plan around only having 6 points for a while, and then once your character's really strong, really established, then, maybe only then, will you get your last points. Okay, that quick aside out of the way, let's talk about the other 4-pointer first. Grasping Wounds. Those of you that have played PathOfExile 1 would be familiar with Progenesis, extremely strong item, and this is Progenesis on a stick. This is really strong in conjunction with you having anything that causes you to recover health passively. Now, in the Ascendancy that we're looking at here, we have Vitality Siphon as an option, and I feel like if people are taking Grasping Wounds, they are probably taking Vitality Siphon as well. These two pair together extremely well, but it is the case that Grasping Wounds is strong on its own, especially in conjunction with the Life Flask. 25% of damage being delayed into the future is something that, as long as you don't build up so much damage over time that you can't sustain it with a Life Flask, it'll be a really, really strong defensive layer. I think it's a solid choice. If you found that you've got good offense on your character already, this is a solid choice for the 2nd set of points that you take in this Ascendancy. And then we have Crimson Power, which has some confusing wording. Gain energy shield from equipped body armor as extra maximum life. The way that I'm reading this is that if your chest armor reads on it, I provide 600 energy shield, then your character is going to gain an additional 600 life as an additional benefit for having this Ascendancy notable. This is something that I think comes online very late in progression as well. I don't think you want this when you're running through the campaign. I don't think you want this when you're early into endgame. I don't think you really want this until you start getting some truly sublime endgame crafted items. At that point, consider respecking into Crimson Power. That's going to be when you want this, and I don't think you do want it earlier. Now let's have a look at the really stacked small nodes. Firstly though, we're going to start with the one that I'm just not sold on, and that is Open Sores in position 3 here. Your curses have infinite duration. I could be wrong about this, but my feeling is that this is just simply not doing enough. There's definitely an upside there. It is powerful because it allows you to invest more of your playtime into dealing damage to an enemy, less into debuffing, more into dealing damage, but I just am not convinced that this is enough power to merit an entire Ascendancy notable. My first thoughts are, do not take this notable. It might turn out that there's some corner cases that it's good in. It might turn out that there's some specific curse skills that it's really good with, but in general, I'm not sold. Now we have the two generically really good ones, and these are fantastic, and they're going to put a lot of pressure on anyone that wants to take one of these 4-point nodes here, because then you're only going to be able to take one of these. In position 2, we have Vitality Siphon. This is a big number. 10% of spell damage is leeched as life. It's important to know that from what we know about the way leech works in PathOfExile 2, there is going to be a hidden stat on monsters called leech resistance, and that is effectively going to be a nerf to the player's ability to leech from them. The more powerful a monster is, the larger this stat's going to get. So what GGG are trying to avoid by the introduction of this life leech capping, this controlling of life leech, is avoiding a situation where player life recovery can get so high that players can yo-yo from down at 1 health up to full health in a single server tick. This is genuinely possible in PathOfExile 1, and it means that essentially monsters that don't threaten to do more life than the player's maximum health pool is, basically don't make any meaningful attacks on the player. Every ability that monsters do, all it does is contribute screen clutter, unless it's capable of one-shotting you. In PathOfExile 2, they want there to be more granularity. They don't want you to go from full life to negative 3,000 life in a single server tick. They want that to be a process that takes enough time that you've got the ability to react. In order to do this, though, they have to stop you from going from 1 health up to full health every single frame, and that means constraining life leech. It also means constraining a bunch of other mechanics that got into PathOfExile 1 that in many cases are more out of control than life leech can get in that game. All of that game balance stuff out of the way, 10% of spell damage leached as life is a huge number, and this is going to be really powerful. It also is really good at neutralizing the drawback of Sanguimancy. All of the life you're having to spend there, this is then going to allow you to leech all of that back. But on top of that, this is just absolutely phenomenal with Grasping Wounds, where Grasping Wounds is going to cause you to be at fairly low life, but also taking damage over time, and that's a situation that Leech excels at bailing you out of. So essentially, Vitality Siphon is really, really strong. I feel like this is the best defensive node on the tree for early on. Later on, you might find that Grasping Wounds is a superior one. Of course, you might elect to take both. We also need to talk about Blood Barbs. Now, this looks generically good, but there's also some potential synergies and a whole bunch of questions that this one opens up. So, here's my first question. If this text existed in PathOfExile 1, elemental damage also contributes to bleeding magnitude, or in that case, it would be elemental damages capable of bleeding. This kind of wouldn't quite get there in PathOfExile 1. And the reason for that is that you can't inflict bleed with spells. Most of the rest of this Ascendancy is spell-based. There are enough points that you could have a melee-based witch character that was going to take the Blood Barbs, obviously you're forced to take Sanguimancy, and then was going to go down to Crimson Power. That could be something you could set up, but it feels like you're being shoehorned into exactly those 4 nodes if you wanted to play something that was a Blood Mage and that was attack-based elemental damage. The other thing, though, that a lot of people have been thinking, and this is certainly the way that I read this when I first saw it, my interpretation was that elemental damage also contributes to bleeding magnitude does work for spells. If that's the case, and that's the way I think it is, but I'm not sure, Blood Barbs is going to be a generic good stuff node that also does a few interesting things if you want to go all in on bleed. And I've got to say, there is something really cool about the class power fantasy of just conjuring up a fireball, but this fireball has a whole bunch of little bits of rusty metal embedded into it. You fire it off at the enemy, it explodes in the middle of a big pack of monsters, and the shards that you've imbued in there because of the extra physical damage that's added, they become barbs, they start things bleeding, and the fire actually contributes to that because of the blood-fueled nature of your magic as a character. This is a cool concept. I really hope it works. Now, if Blood Barbs does have the more favorable interpretation, which is that your elemental damage from spells can contribute to bleeds as well as elemental damage from attacks, then in that situation, I think it's got a lot of potential, but it is the only thing that is pushing you in an ailment direction on this tree. Lastly, though, you could just use it for generic good stuff. Like if you're casting a fireball and that fireball does 10% more damage because you've got 10% of damage as added physical damage, that's not bad either. So Blood Barbs definitely has some power in it, and there's some interesting things going on here alongside all of the more explicitly defensive aspects of most of this Ascendancy. So this would mean that you've got Blood Barbs, Gore Spike, and Sunder the Flesh are your options if you wanted to go all-out offense. Or you could go all-out defense by taking Vitality Siphon, Grasping Wounds, Crimson Power. But in most cases, you're probably going to take a mix and a match of the two. You're going to take some of the things you think are best and come together with a plan that balances offense and defense. That's my final thoughts as to where the Blood Mage is going to go. How am I going to start it? I am going to be flexible. I'm going to work out what I need when I need it. And I'm going to pick nodes based upon what weaknesses my character has at the time. So for instance, if I get into a situation that I've just got more critical strike on gear than I was expecting to get, then in that case, maybe I'll already go into Sunder the Flesh early. And then I'll take Sunder the Flesh as my 3rd node and Vitality Siphon as my 4th, and I'll end up playing a critical strike based character from pretty early on. Alternately, if my gear doesn't support that playstyle early, I'm going Vitality Siphon, Blood Barbs, and Grasping Wounds, And the order that I take those is just going to depend upon what's blocking my progress harder. So I'm finding that my biggest problem is that I'm getting one shot, then I'm taking Grasping Wounds. If I feel that it's life recovery that's my biggest weakness, Vitality Siphon. And if it's damage that's my biggest weakness, well then of course I'm going to take Blood Barbs. I want to experiment with the concept of inflicting bleed with spells with Blood Barbs, see if that's any good or not, and try and get some answers to that. I can't make any promises that it will work, but we'll find that out. And then eventually, I think though, the plan will be to respec entirely, go Sunder the Flesh because crits are good, crits are always really good. And then the last points will probably be Vitality Siphon because I feel life recovery is going to be more pressured in Path of Exile 2 than anything else. But if it's not life recovery that's pressured, then we'll go Grasping Wounds instead. Those are my thoughts. That's how I'm going to get started when it becomes Saturday my local, which might be Friday in your local, and Path of Exile 2 goes live. As for the rest of the character, that's all going to have to be planned once we get the passive tree, which likely will be data mined about 12 to 15 hours before the game goes live. I will see you then. May Varlorbs have interesting results, and also, I've got a merchandise store, which I'll put a link to down in the description below.